As Governor General and as a parishioner of St. Bartholomew's Church, I attended a number of the Remembrance Day services in the church, and I spoke at some of them. I was particularly pleased to do so in the presence of the East Window, commemorating as it does the loss of 10 members of the viceregal staff who fell in the First World War. My wife Sharon and I have been pleased to be friends and supporters of St. Bartholomew's Church. Thus, it gives me great pleasure to lend my support to the creation by the parish of a film commemorating the Getty's Window.
The window created by Wilhelmina Geddes and installed in St. Bartholomew's Church in 1919 is a triumph of stained glass artistry. Anyone entering the church is struck by its intense colours and also by its vision of the Anglican faith, which was very much of its time, a muscular Christianity where men fought and women wept. Yet the window's imagery continues to resonate and impress. It's an intriguing piece of history and also a testament of faith, just like St. Bart's itself. The church was already more than 50 years old when the window arrived. The parish of St. Bart's was founded on 24th of August 1867, St. Bartholomew's Day, 8 weeks after Confederation was proclaimed. The following May, the cornerstone of the church was laid by Governor General Lord Monck. Building proceeded rapidly, and the first service in the building took place between its sturdy stone walls on Christmas Day, 1868. A city directory of 1869 described the church as a chaste little structure, without external adornment, and even dismissed its appearance as, quote, anything but striking or attractive. A few improvements slowly arrived. St. Bartholomew's acquired its first stained glass window in 1886. A 23-year-old parishioner named William Brough Osgood was killed during the Northwest Campaign in 1885. His fellow parishioners clubbed together to erect a window in his memory. From its earliest days, St. Bart's congregation had some distinguished members, successive governors general and their families. When Ottawa was chosen as the federal capital, the government acquired Rideau Hall as its viceregal residence. The church's proximity to Rideau Hall effectively made it the parish church of the governors-general, and most of the governors-general, with their wives, became devoted, regular, and active members of the parish. Canadians were particularly proud in 1911 when a member of the royal family, Prince Arthur, Duke of Connaught, and the uncle of King George V, became Canada's 10th Governor-General. A professional soldier, he had served in a British regiment in Canada between 1869 and 1870 during the Second Fenian Raid. The Duke, the Duchess, and Princess Patricia, the youngest of their 3 children, worshipped regularly at St. Bartholomew's, but they couldn't help noticing the church's shabby condition. The Duchess got to work. She arranged for the installation of new carpets, she donated a cross and candlesticks for the altar, and she provided altar flowers. Meanwhile, the Duke arranged for St. Bartholomew's to be given the organ that had been in the Rideau Hall chapel and then kept in storage. But the Connaughts' best remembered legacy to Canada involves their daughter, Princess Patricia. A professionally trained artist, Princess Patricia produced many oil paintings, such as this view of the Rockies. She would be an important influence in the eventual choice of a stained glass artist. 2 weeks after the outbreak of the First World War, Hamilton Gault, a Montreal businessman and veteran of the South African War, announced that he would finance a new infantry unit. Gault asked Princess Patricia if he could name the new regiment the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry. She was thrilled and immediately sewed a camp flag for the PPCL I. This flag, better known as the colours, was blessed on the altar of St. Bartholomew's and then presented to the regiment. The Princess Pats left for England within 3 weeks of the regiment's formation, under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Francis D. Farquhar. Farquhar was an aide and personal friend to the Duke of Connaught, as well as being a parishioner of St. Bartholomew's. Farquhar was one of the regiment's first tragic victims. He was killed in the trenches in Belgium on the 9th of March, 1915. A memorial service for him was held at St. Bartholomew's, with the Duke and Duchess of Connaught and Princess Patricia in attendance. Farquhar's successor, Lieutenant Colonel Herbert Buller, was also a parishioner and also a casualty of war. He was killed in action on June 2nd, 1916. There was a happier outcome for another military aide of the Duke of Connaught, Alexander Ramsay. He attended St. Bart's along with Princess Patricia, who by now had become Colonel-in-Chief of the Princess Pats. In fact, in 1918, she placed a laurel wreath on the colours that she had sewn for her regiment. And a few months later, Princess Pat and Alexander Ramsay were married, with the princess becoming Lady Ramsay. St. Bartholomew's has maintained a strong link with the PPCLI, and the regiment placed a plaque in the church to celebrate the 100th anniversary of its founding. Countess Mountbatten succeeded Lady Patricia as Colonel-in-Chief, and in 1982 unveiled a plaque to Lady Patricia in the church. Yet before the First World War, St. Bart's still had little adornment other than a few pieces of stained glass, a scattering of memorial plaques on the walls, and a new carpet. This lack of decoration during the church's first half-century was exemplified by the large east window, which contained clear glass. When the sun shone during Sunday morning services, the effect on the congregation could be blinding. As a stopgap remedy, the Duchess of Connaught provided a heavy curtain between the east window and the altar in 1913. But the church's interior was dramatically altered 6 years later with the arrival of Wilhelmina Geddes' window, called, quote, "the welcoming of a slain warrior by soldier saints, champions, and angels." Dr. Shirley Ann Brown is going to tell us about the window, its history, images, and symbolism. Dr. Brown is Professor Emerita of Art History and Cultural Expression at York University in Toronto. During her several decades at York, she taught courses in the history of stained glass from the medieval tradition to the contemporary. Her research into Canadian stained glass windows and the Celtic tradition in British art led her to the work of Wilhelmina Geddes and the Geddes window in St. Bartholomew's. She first wrote about this window in an article published in the Irish Arts Review in 1994.
The magnificent stained glass window subsequently installed above the altar is the jewel of St. Bartholomew's Sanctuary and one of Canada's acknowledged art glass treasures. But when it was unveiled on November the 9th, 1919, an audible gasp was the collective reaction of the congregation. The work of an Irish artist named Wilhelmina Geddes and created in Dublin, it heralded a revolutionary approach to a traditional medium in ecclesiastical art. The congregation, and indeed Canada, had never seen anything like it before. The inscription at the bottom left of the window informs us that it was erected by Arthur, Duke of Connaught, Governor General of Canada, to the glory of God and an affectionate memory of his members of his staff who fell in the Great War. When the United Kingdom declared war on Germany, on August the 8th, 1914, most of the Governor General's personal staff immediately went off to assume various active military commands. Casualties occurred quickly. The first was Captain Thomas Rivers Bulkley, who fell on October 20th, 1914 at Ypres. Captain Denzil Newton was killed near Saint-Omer on January the 9th, 1915. By then, an Irish element had been added to the grieving. In early 1915, the Duke invited his close friends, Sir John Leslie, Baronet of Glasslough, and his wife Leonie to visit Ottawa to help assuage their grief at losing their son Norman, who had been killed in action in October 1914. It may have been during that visit that Lady Leslie, Prince Arthur, and Princess Patricia hatched the idea of commissioning a stained glass window as a memorial for the deceased members of the vice-regal household. In a daring move, Lady Leslie, a well-known patron of the arts in Ireland, offered the commission to her close friend, Sarah Purser, the founder and head of An Dúr Glynne, the Tower of Glass, a unique, innovative stained glass studio in Dublin. Established in 1903, it was very involved in the Irish Celtic revival and the arts and crafts movement, which encouraged artists to design according to their personal aesthetic. Sarah Purser awarded the commission to Wilhelmina Geddes sometime in 1915. At the time, Geddes was a relatively unknown 32-year-old Irish woman from Belfast who had been invited to join the Tower of Glass in 1910. Geddes first mentions an Ottawa window in a letter to her boss in December 1915. In it, realizing that her work was idiosyncratic, she wondered if Canadians would understand the window. The St. Bartholomew's window was Geddes' first large stained glass commission, and it took 4 years to complete. Living in Belfast meant she had to mail her ideas and designs to Purser in Dublin, who would then pass them on to Lady Leslie and Princess Patricia in London for comment. The comments were then sent back to her in Belfast. Geddes was a slow and conscientious designer, prone to working in spurts and starts. Over the first 2 years, the design went through at least 5 stages, including a conventional sketch, which she thought looked too much like a Last Judgment because of the dominating Saint Michael. She complained,
"Must St. Michael have a dragon? A half-killed dragon that isn't being killed outright isn't what I care for. I quite understood that the first sketches weren't it, but thought them good enough to send. I quite understand you didn't want it, Judgment. No more did I."
At one point, she rather liked the idea of having a number of the deceased soldiers ascend heavenward on flying horses. When this was rejected as too operatic, and the procession of the newly dead soldiers arriving in paradise was moved to the main register, she commented sarcastically,
"I meant to make the deaders stand, but they look too much like batches of German prisoners in a cinema. I mean, if it's a question of welcoming soldiers, then I would really like to make him shake hands with them and make vague gestures of amiability at large."
She also reacted very negatively to including a yellow lion, taken from the royal coat of arms of the United Kingdom, because it was too difficult to work into the design. The evolution of Geddes' ideas and her frustration are clearly indicated when she wrote to Purser in mid-1917.
"Who suggested the subjects? Because if it was you or Canon D, I wonder, wouldn't it be more entertaining to put in soldier saints like Saint Sebastian and George instead of centurions? Longinus I would like well in any case. There can't be any objection to little developments of the main subject. And 2 special archangels instead of a number of plain angels. An alternative version with everything quite different from the others wouldn't be worth trying, I suppose."
She got her way. and soon perfected the design to everyone's satisfaction. The commission was finally confirmed in May 1917 at a cost of £500. The result of all her tribulation and angst was to be the most iconographically complex window Geddes ever made, visualized in her unique fashion. The subject is the welcoming of a slain warrior into the eternal company of soldier saints, champions, and angels. The warrior, who personifies all the memorialized men, strides in from the left, wrapped in a crimson cloak and crowned with the laurel wreath of victory, carrying a broken spear. He is conducted by Raphael, the angel of healing, and by Gabriel, the angel of the Annunciation and Resurrection. Behind them, the angel of death, in dark robes, holds a cup embossed with a passion flower. The angel of peace hovers above. In the middle section, they are met by 3 Roman soldier saints, Longinus, Sebastian, and Martin. Above them looms Michael, the militant archangel and patron saint of soldiers. To the right, St. George, England's patron saint, awaits on horseback. Geddes stood by the medieval principle that stained glass is a 2-dimensional medium, and therefore pictorial effects and perspective space have no place in its design. No architectural backgrounds or landscapes are to be found in her work. Her windows were a true break from the romantic illusionism of her contemporary artists. The window is crowded with figures and detail ranging in size from large to minuscule. She inserted the exploits of each saint in small scale near their figures. Near his head, Longinus can be seen as the mounted soldier who pierces the crucified Christ's side. On the other side of Sebastian's massive neck, the banner carries a row of kneeling archers, a reference to his martyrdom. To the left of Martin's head, he is the mounted soldier dividing his cloak to share with the beggar dressed in rags. In the right light, the Roman soldiers are joined by 3 medieval saints. The funeral of the 9th century East Anglian King Edmund, murdered by the Danes, is depicted by his left shoulder. His gold crown is embossed with the tiny wolves who protected his dismembered head until it was safely restored to his body and buried. Joan of Arc is half hidden behind her male companions because Geddes was reluctant to include a female in the procession of warrior saints.
Joan of Arc is in it too, unobtrusively. But I didn't want ladies in it. It's meant to be warlike.
In her vignette, Joan is shown riding into the battle at Orléans in 1429. Vignettes for Louis IX, a 13th century French king, refer to his overseas crusades and battles. Above the historical saints, St. George and his magnificent gray steed dominate the upper part of the right window. His banner shows him as a knight in full tilt, recalling the legend of his rescuing a maiden from a dragon. Wilhelmina Geddes frequently made literary references in her work, often in the choice of her subsidiary figures. Here, she chose to include 9 characters from the legend of King Arthur and his Knights of the Round Table, as formulated in Sir Arthur Mallory's 15th century Le Morte d'Arthur. This should not be seen merely as a rather obvious play on the patron's name. The legendary Arthurian heroes were widely interpreted as the epitome of heroism and warrior ideals, models for all that was worthy in British culture and history. Above St. George, Geddes included the knights Tristram, Lancelot, and Palomides, embodiments of the tireless fighting man. In the left window section, around the Angel of Peace, the quest for the Holy Grail, the cup used by Christ at the Last Supper, features the three successful knights, Percival, Galahad, and Bors. The ship with the angel guide carrying the three knights towards the vision of the Holy Grail appears 3 times on a tiny scale. With the attainment of their quest, these men achieved their own inner peace, a peace which also was gained by the memorialized soldiers. In the center window, the background concentrates on the death of King Arthur. Between the sweep of Michael's great crimson wings, Arthur rides in full armor. His banner pictures the scene of the women mourning his body as it is borne away in a boat to Avalon, with Sir Bedivere and an angel as solemn witnesses. A row of female figures flanks the archangel's knees with the inscription, "These are they that I fought for in righteous quarrel." They are accompanied by Sir Gawain on a white horse. This refers to the vision and words of Gawain which came to King Arthur the night before he was mortally wounded in combat against his son Mordred. All of these figures, large and small, are identified with their names inscribed nearby, a characteristic of Getty's windows. She wanted to draw people into a close study of her images and to be certain that viewers would understand what she was portraying. In June 1917, she wrote to Sarah Purser,
It's far better fun when they have names and flags with their devices.
The upper tracery is filled with legions of minute winged angels descending from the heavenly citadel to join the new arrival. To the left are the angels of peace with their musical pipes, and to the right are the armored angels of war. At the base of the window, a single recumbent figure represents the victims of war, guarded by 2 sentries and mourned by a solitary, crouched figure in dark purple. A procession of female singers and mourners, along with men too old to fight, join together in a poignant procession of grief before a blazing citadel. The list of the commemorated dead was not inserted into the window, but was placed instead on a separate plaque on the wall. When the commission for the window was finalized in May 1917, the Duke wrote to Lady Leslie,
Owing to the date of the termination of the war being uncertain, and that the names of the fallen officers might still have to be added to, their names, appointments, and regiments should be put on a brass plate.
Indeed, by the war's end, the toll had risen to 10 men, 3 of whom had been with the Princess Pats. Geddes was relieved by the decision to divide the dedicatory inscription, since she was afraid it would take up too much space and destroy the design of her predella panels. It took another 1.5 years before the window was completed. Getty's work answered to a different aesthetic from that of the stained glass produced by the large commercial studios. The human figure always dominates her compositions, and she created a new male prototype for stained glass. Modern-looking figures, close-shaven with cropped hair, serious and thoughtful men, very different from the popular, vacuous late Victorian model. Their sinewy bodies covered with wet-fold drapery reflect her consummate skill in life drawing. After her first visit to France in 1914, where she studied the great medieval windows at Chartres Cathedral, she said,
I go back to the 13th century, where the figures are not only more impressive, but more modern than anything that has been done since in the medium. I believe that strength of design and intensity of color are the qualities to be aimed at in stained glass.
Indeed, light and color are the essence of stained glass. The streams of colored light created as sunlight passes through the transparent colored glass transform the interior space into a sacred jewel-like setting, conducive to contemplation and meditation. With saturated coloration, St. Bartholomew's window conveys the deep spiritual solemnity and intensity of medieval windows. At the end of May 1919, the completed window was exhibited in Dublin, then in London, en route to Canada. The 69-year-old Duke of Connaught viewed the window in London, as did his entourage and many of the stained glass community. The window was officially unveiled in St. Bartholomew's on Sunday, November 9, 1919, by the Duke's 25-year-old nephew, Edward, Prince of Wales. The next day's report in the Ottawa Citizen described how an audible gasp swept through the congregation when the prince pulled the cord and the drapery covering the window fell away. The congregation had not been consulted about the details of the window, and the gasp uttered when they first saw it must remain enigmatic. There seems to have been some confusion caused by the amount of detail in the window, but it was very much appreciated by the rector, Reverend Francis Henry Bruin. In his thank you letter to Geddes, he noted,
"My wife says that it does not matter if the sermon is dull. There is so much to think about in the window. I myself like to be constantly discovering some new detail. Too much detail is a criticism I cannot accept. And after all, I live more or less with the window and ought to be a judge on that point. I find that the window grows on me, and I love it more the whole time."
Geddes explained,
A public monument's one thing, and one for heartbroken relatives is another.
her Ottawa window is deeply religious, with a strong expression of emotion and sentiment, but it is not theological or liturgical. In St. Bartholomew's window, Geddes decided not to dwell on the horrors of war, but by employing symbolic figures and literary references, she created a most expressive tribute to human heroism and sacrifice.
Professor Shirley Ann Brown and Canon David Clooney had a conversation about their feelings about St. Bart's famous window.
What really caught my eye is at the very center of the window. And if you think about the window, and it's 3 panels, in the center, you see the little blue square there that is on the pennant of Longinus. And Longinus was the Roman centurion who was at the foot of the cross and witnessed that this was, witnessed Christ put his sword in Christ's side and water came out, and was a person who said, truly this was the Son of God. So this is this witness of someone who's clearly not Christian at the foot of the cross, and on the pennant placed exactly in the center of the window. And the pennant for Longinus is quite different from the pennants of the other 5, but it's at the center. And what is at the center? He's there on his horse, but it's Christ on the cross. Now, it's not just a crucifixion, because that's usually Christ being on the cross, distorted and contorted, and it's sad, and we see the suffering. This is Christ, yes, on the cross, but what we sometimes call the Christus Rex, a resurrected Christ. So it's somewhere in between. And he's got a halo around his head, and there's light coming from there. So for me, living with it and thinking about it, It's at the center. The artist is saying, look at this, but the artist is also saying this is only tiny in terms of the whole window, and it's hidden in plain sight.
Whether or not Geddes herself intended these interpretations, we will never know. She herself had been brought up as a strict Methodist, but she spent her life working, creating religious windows. Not all of her windows are religious, but the majority are. So she was well versed in the legends of the saints and theological arguments. Whether she brought them into the window in conscious use, we will never know. But the wonderful thing about art, and about public art in particular, and art with imagery in it, is a narrative in it, is that once it leaves the artist's studios, it becomes a public monument. And people bring their own interpretation, their own feeling, their own meaning to what they are looking at, their own experiences. That's what is the most wonderful thing about art. Its message changes with its location and with the people that are viewing it. And this window, I think, is an absolutely wonderful example of that kind of transmission of meaning.
But what was the context in which the Geddes window was conceived, created, and installed? Why did Canadians want to memorialize war? Dr. Tim Cook explains the impact of the 1914-1918 war on Canadian society and the ways in which Canada's war dead have been commemorated. Tim Cook is Canada's leading expert on the First World War and Canadian soldiers' experience of it. Dr. Cook is a historian at the Canadian War Museum and is the author of more than a dozen award-winning books, plus numerous articles and chapters.
It's an honor to be asked to speak in this place of worship and this site of history. The Great War Armistice of November 11th, 1918 ended the killing on the Western Front, but the reverberations of those deaths, the mass trauma of more than 66,000 lost Canadians during the war and in its immediate aftermath, has echoed through history. Canada was a nation of fewer than 8 million, and today, with a population 4.5 times greater, the equivalent losses would be around 300,000 dead in a 4-year period. One can scarcely imagine such grief across the Dominion as every city, town, village, and hamlet mourn for the boys, young and middle-aged men, and some women serving as nurses who marched off to war, never to return. Canada's treatment of the fallen soldiers helped to ease the grief of a country and its people, allowing them to mourn and to make meaning of the war. Before I speak to that, I'll offer a brief glimpse into Canada's part in the Great War. Canada was engaged in a total war effort of nearly unlimited scale. The country of 8 million saw 620,000 Canadians in uniform. Those at home worked the fields and on the factory floor to support the war effort. As an agrarian nation, Canada sent millions of bushels of wheat overseas to feed the Allied armies. And by 1917, about 1/4 of all shells fired in the British Expeditionary Force was made in Canadian factories. That alone was an astonishing contribution. At the sharp end, Canada's primary fighting force, the Canadian Corps, 100,000 strong and commanded by Canadian Sir Arthur Currie from June of 1917, symbolized the nation's war effort. The Corps delivered victories at Vimy, Hill 70, Passchendaele, Amiens, and in many other battles, but all came at a withering cost. Of those 66,000 Canadians who were killed or died of their wounds, there were over 18,000 Canadians whose bodies were lost. They had been blown out of existence or swallowed in the mud of Passchendaele or on the Somme. There were also 6,846 unknown Canadian soldiers. Their bodies were recovered, but their identities had vanished because of trauma or some other issue where they were misidentified. Their headstones are often inscribed with the name, "A Canadian Soldier of the Great War, known unto God." It is a haunting phrase. After the armistice, the Imperial War Graves Commission, which was established in 1917 and continues to this day as the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, began in earnest the exhumation of the dead and reinterring them in the new cemeteries. Canada followed the imperial death policy and left our fallen soldiers overseas, close to the battlefields, hospitals, or training camps where they fell or succumbed to their wounds, still lying with their comrades. Within a few years, there were over 1,000 new cemeteries. There was a conscious decision to ensure that the cemeteries were austere in nature and devoid of large-scale statues or sculptures, although most cemeteries contain a stone of remembrance, 12 feet in height and lying raised upon 3 steps, creating a sense of permanency, strength, and majesty, with an inscription, "Their name liveth forevermore." One of the remarkable aspects of the Imperial War Graves Commission death policy was the decision of uniformity of headstones and equality of treatment, regardless of rank. Privates received the same recognition as generals. It was a radical vision at the time, especially in class-stratified Britain. In death, all were equal. The Canadian headstones are similar to those of the British, but are distinguished with an iconic maple leaf, while Newfoundlanders' headstones are inscribed with the caribou. These headstones also allowed for the next of kin to capture their emotions in short epitaphs, which remain, more than 100 years later, still raw in their grief. A few read, "Our dear daddy and our war hero, we miss you. Je fais mon devoir." Killed in action, beloved daughter of Angus and Mary Maud MacDonald, Brantford, Canada. The enormity of the war and the depth of the sacrifice were to be marked solemnly across Canadian society and throughout much of the world. King George V asked in 1919 on November 11th for 2 minutes of silence to be observed on Armistice Day. The silence blanketed busy streets across Canada as people stood at 11 a.m., minds cast back to the war that had ended a year before. This stillness was no call to victory, but a deep reflection for those who never came home. Anguish and loss over the death of a loved one are usually done in private. Now that loss was shared in public by a nation, by an empire. Remembrance Day, as Armistice Day was renamed in 1931, remains with us to this day. The poppy was another important ritual and symbol of the war, and one twinned with Remembrance Day. The scarlet poppies, first worn by Canadians in 1921, were inspired by the iconic words of John McCrae's poem In Flanders Fields, with its vivid imagery of the fallen enwrapped in the red flowers. Those poppies are still with us, emblems of loss, objects of remembrance. Canadians turned to commemorating the war in many ways. Medals and official death notices were issued. Plaques listed the fallen for businesses, high schools, and universities. In fact, in Newfoundland, still an independent colony, Memorial University was established as a living memorial to the war and to the veterans. Pavilions, fountains, and libraries marked the dead. They were also remembered in metal, War trophies were returned from overseas, captured German artillery pieces and machine guns, tangible signs of victory that were displayed prominently. In churches across the country, as well as in universities, city halls, and libraries, artists were commissioned to create memorial stained glass windows. And there were the local stone cenotaphs erected in most communities to mark the fallen, which became powerful sites of remembrance and places of gathering on Remembrance Day. Across the country, there was a remarkable diversity and breadth to the marking of this war. Many of those memorials, symbols, and rituals are still with us today, hiding in plain sight in our community, in our nation's capital, and overseas. At the unveiling of the National War Memorial in May of 1939, King George VI told Canadians that the response, as the memorial is called, revealed the very soul of the nation. We continue to reflect upon the King's words when we stand at the National Memorial or across the country at the site of thousands of community memorials. To visit these monuments, memorials, or cemeteries is to feel the grief of silenced and shattered dreams. And yet, one also feels pride and a sense of gratitude that the fallen have been cared for and continue to be cared for. Many Canadians feel that it is our duty to mark the fallen, and that, perhaps, is one of the most enduring links from that terrible war to the present, revealing that within the war's long shadow, there is an ever-burning torch of light, of hope, and of shared sense of responsibility by generations past, present, and those that are to come.
What happened to the artist after she had finished the St. Bartholomew's window, the first major commission of her career? It was not an altogether happy story. In early 1920, Wilhelmina Geddes started work in Belfast on another memorial window, this one destined for a church in the north of England. She was mainly living in Belfast with her family, but her financial situation was precarious. Impatient with the working practices of her Dublin studio, she decided to go it alone. So in 1925, Geddes, now 38, moved to England. However, she spent her first 6 months there at London's Maudsley Hospital, where she was treated for the depression, which she battled for much of her life. During these months, she worked on a bold design for a memorial window for a Middlesex church. In late 1926, Geddes rented a studio in the Fulham Glass House in London, where she would work for the next 30 years. Soon, she was winning major commissions in Ireland and beyond. One was for a big rose window to be presented by the British Army and Royal Air Force to the rebuilt cathedral at Ypres in Belgium. But the commission exhausted her, physically and mentally. However, her spirits were raised when her magnificent Ottawa window, along with the Ypres window, received favourable notice in the prestigious Fortnightly Review on the eve of the Second World War. Her living conditions continued to deteriorate. Money was still short, and she frequently had to ask her mother and brother back in Ireland for financial help. The London Blitz and wartime shortages exacted a heavy toll on her. After the war, she managed to complete 4 more windows, despite rheumatism and problems with her eyesight. But she began to show the symptoms of arterial sclerosis that would eventually take her life in 1955 when she was 68. She was buried in Northern Ireland alongside her mother. Altogether, Wilhelmina Geddes completed 26 stained glass windows, including panels depicting Celtic myths for the Belfast Art Gallery and windows for a New Zealand chapel. She also produced lino cuts and illustrations for books, magazines, and posters, but her extraordinary stained glass works are the lasting memorial to her art. On November the 9th, 1919, the day of the unveiling of the window at St. Bartholomew's, the rector, the Reverend Francis Bruin, wrote to Wilhelmina Geddes that, quote, "If you love Ireland, I am sure that you will be glad to know that those who come to St. Bartholomew's will always think kindly of the land which gave them so valuable a possession. We at St. Bartholomew's have been blessed with this unique window. We will always be grateful for Wilhelmina Geddes's artistic vision. She has left us a lasting legacy."
you.